Welcome to MedicoApp's BDS Express. In today's masterclass, we'll be learning development of face. So let's start with the development of face. So a face, it is unique to each person and it is the basis of their own identity. Now the embryological origin of the same, that is the face for all humans, and it is similar to other mammals as well. So the development of face, it is complex and it involves the formation and the coordination of various tissue to form the final product. Now the oropharyngeal membrane where the face eventually forms, they can already be seen in the embryo as early as 3 weeks. Okay, so it can be seen as early as 3 weeks between the enlarging areas of the heart and the brain. So the facial embryology begins between the 4 to 8 weeks and involves a series of highly coordinated events which is based on the programmed data in the cellular DNA. So during 3rd week of embryonic development, an oropharyngeal membrane initially appear at the site of future face. So this comprises of ectoderm as well as endoderm, which are lining externally and internally respectively. So here in this image you can see that this is the endoderm and this is the notochondrial cord and this is the notochondrial plate. Now during the 4th week, the oropharyngeal membrane, they begin to break down in order to become the future oral cavity and sits at the beginning of the digestive tract. So this is the ectoderm which is lining the oropharyngeal membrane from the outside, that is externally, and this is the endoderm, that is internally. Now the oropharyngeal membrane, it is surrounded by several prominences. Prominences means processes that will eventually give rise to the face. So the frontonasal process, this structure, this is the frontonasal process. They arise from the neural crest cell and they cover the forebrain. So it will give rise to 2 medial nasal processes and 2 lateral processes. So 2 medial and the 2 lateral nasal processes. Now the lateral nasal processes, they develop into the lateral nasal placodes. So this will give rise to nasal placodes. And the medial nasal process develops medially to the nasal placode and will eventually fuse with the midline. So they fuse with the midline to form the intermaxillary process, and by the 10th week, that is by the 10th week of gestation, the intermaxillary process will form the nasal bridge and the philtrum. So this will forms the nasal bridge and the philtrum. Now the tissue of the first mandibular pharyngeal arch, they originate from the mesoderm and the neural crest cell, and the first arch, they will give rise to 2 mandibular processes. So this is the mandibular arch. So 2 mandibular processes will be formed and they fuse together to form the complete mandible, and the 2 maxillary processes will eventually fuse to form the palate. So similarly, they are repeating the same thing. The structure of the external face, they are derived from the 2 sources, and they are frontonasal prominence and mandibular and the maxillary prominences. So first is frontonasal prominence. It is formed by the proliferation of the mesenchymal neural crest cell ventral to the forebrain, and second is mandibular and the maxillary prominences. So part of the first pharyngeal arch, a space lie between the maxillary prominences covered by the oropharyngeal membrane, and this is known as stomatodeum, and the precursor to the mouth and the pituitary gland. Then next what happens? Nasal development is instigated by the appearance of the raised bumps called as nasal placodes. So here will be nasal placodes on both sides of the frontonasal prominences. Then they invaginate to form the nasal pit with medial and the lateral nasal prominences on either side. So these are the prominences you can see, and these are the pit. Then as the maxillary prominences expand medially, the nasal prominences are pushed closer to the midline, and then they fuse to form the nose and the philtrum area, and the maxillary prominences then fuse with the nasal prominences and thereafter fuses in midline to form a continuous suture, and it forms the palate as well. Now the prominences and their derivative. So frontonasal prominence will give rise to forehead, bridge of the nose, medial and the lateral nasal prominences. Medial nasal wall will give rise to philtrum, primary palate, upper four incisor and associated jaw. Lateral nasal prominence will give rise to side of the jaw. Then maxillary, that is the first pharyngeal arch, will give rise to cheek, lateral upper lip, secondary palate, lateral upper jaw, and mandibular first pharyngeal arch will give rise to lower lip and the jaw. So in embryology, one question is usually asked, and either they can ask the development of the face, or you can say the development of the pharyngeal pouches. All these, they are the important question to be asked in embryology. Thank you.